Deploying a servlet using Invoker Servlet. In the preceding lessons, we discussed about various methods of creating a servlet and deploying a servlet in Tomcat web server by creating a web application. Here we will discuss about the other method of deploying a servlet. Just recall what we have done in the previous lesson. In the previous lesson, first we created a web application. Afterwards, we placed the directory named webinf inside the web application directory. Webinf directory contains two subdirectories, namely classes, lib, and a file named Web Dot Xml, which is a deployment descriptor. Afterwards, we compiled the servlet class using Java compiler and placed the class file in the classes subdirectory present inside the web application directory. Later, we defined the servlet and provided the mapping for the servlet in the deployment descriptor, i.e. Web.xml file. Afterwards, we started the server and deployed the servlet using the path URL given in the mapping element. There's only a small difference between this lesson and the preceding one. Here, we won't create the web application and won't define our servlet in a deployment descriptor. Hopefully, you are familiar with the subdirectories of Tomcat directory, especially web apps. The root directory for all web applications is root directory, which is placed under web apps directory. Here, we have to use the Invoker Servlet to deploy the servlets. Invoker Servlet is a servlet that invokes other servlets. In most of the web applications, the Invoker Servlet is used to serve the requests to servlets that have not been registered in the web application deployment descriptor. Here we have to do two things. First, we need to remove the comments for the definition of Invoker Servlet present inside a principal web.xml file. The principal and root deployment descriptor, i.e. web.xml for all web applications, are placed under the conf directory. Open this web.xml file. Find out the definition for Invoker Servlet and remove the comments for that particular definition part. Now, the second thing is, we must provide the mapping for the Invoker Servlet in the corresponding web application. Here, we didn't create any web application. Thus, we can use root directory. Open the web.xml file in the webinf directory under the root directory. The mapping for the invoker will be like this. Here we gave the URL pattern as servlet, which means we simply type the URL path for deploying a servlet, like this. When compared to the previous URL path, here we needn't give the web application name. Compile the servlet and place the compiled servlet class inside the classes directory under the webinf of a root directory. Here also we use the name Hello World Servlet Program. Store the class file inside the classes directory. I hope you know the steps for starting the server. Let's start the server. Type this URL in the address bar of the browser and press Enter. Now you are looking at the output, which shows Hello World. Well, I hope you have learned the two methods for deploying the servlet. Here is a tip for you. If your web application contains more number of servlets, then we have to use Invoker Servlet method because it saves a lot of time. If you go by the first method, we need to define the servlet and provide mapping for all the servlets in the deployment descriptor. It will lead to loss of time and more confusion because we have to remember all the URL patterns. Thus, in this case, we are better using the Invoker Servlet method. Deployment descriptor. Deployment descriptor, DD, is a component in Java.EE applications that describes how a web application should be deployed. It's an XML file provided with each module of the application, and describes the configuration information for that module. It must be placed in webinf subdirectory, directly under the web application root. There are different types of deployment descriptors. They are EJB deployment descriptor, described in the Enterprise Java Beans specification, Web Deployment Descriptor, described in the Servlet specification, and Application and Application Client Deployment Descriptors, described in the Java.EE specification. Here is the diagrammatic representation of various modules in Java.EE application that have their own deployment descriptors. Here the DD indicates Deployment Descriptor. Now we will discuss the few important elements in the deployment descriptor. Web App. This is the main tag of a web application, for example the root tag. You have to define all the elements to be deployed, like servlets and EJB, etc., and any more configurations needed for those elements, like listeners and session configuration, etc., inside the tag. Here is the syntax of web app in Web Dot Xml. Display name and description. These tags are used to display the name of your web application and to provide the short description about your web application. Here is the structure of these tags in Web.xml file. Context param. It is used to specify the context initialization parameters for a Java.EE application. Here we see the codes for how to initialize a parameter. Init param. It is used to specify the initialization parameters for a particular servlet, but the context initialization parameters are used by all servlets. Here we see the codes to initialize a parameter. MIME mapping. It is used to specify the mapping between a file extension and a MIME type. The code that gives the mapping for HTML files looks like this. Servlet. It is used to define a servlet, i.e., the servlet name should be mapped to the particular servlet class. This code shows defining a servlet. Servlet mapping. It is used to specify the mapping between a servlet and a URL pattern. The code shows the mapping of a servlet. Servlet and servlet mapping is used to deploy a servlet. To deploy a servlet, we have to give the particular URL pattern, like this. Then, by using the servlet name, the corresponding servlet class is executed. Session config. It is used to specify the session information for a servlet such as session timeout value. The code that assigns the timeout value for a servlet is 30 minutes, given here. Listener. It is used to specify the name of the listener class that responds to a servlet during a life cycle event. The code shown here tells the application the context listener is listening the event. So far we have discussed about the elements of deployment descriptor. Here is the sample deployment descriptor file, i.e. Web.xml. Here, the first line describes the version of XML, and the next line shows the web app element had many attributes to define the document. We will discuss this later. Next, in this web application, we deployed a servlet, show request headers. So here we define the servlet and a URL mapping for that servlet. Till now we've discussed about the deployment descriptor and its elements. We can add more numbers of deployment descriptor elements while using EJB in an application. We will discuss later about those elements. If you want to know more about Deployment Descriptor, refer to these links.